ты! Да наоборот. Ой, там мне что такое-то. Что такое? Потому что... Да нет, делать нечего, говорит ему, да, нет. Мне ему нечего делать, мне. Так, что ты хотел-то? То есть, то нет, не помнишь. Ой, какое-то все долго тут. О, это самое? Ну да. А что ты? Наоборот, вот да наоборот. Да наоборот. Да наоборот, значит. Да наоборот. Да наоборот. Да наоборот. Вот это она и делает. Фишка.
каждый вечер, когда его укутываю. Я переживаю очень о нем. Боюсь, чтобы ничего не случилось с ним.
Number of innovations in terms of gameplay innovations. The turn-based battle system remained intact, but players could now see hit points above a target following attacks or healing moves instead of a caption display of the hit points. This is also the first Final Fantasy game to feature auto-targeting for physical attacks after an enemy or ally has been killed. It's also the first game to feature a job system players could use to improve their overall battle stats by playing through a number of different job sets. The job system would go on to become a staple for the series. New battle commands were added to the game specifically based on a player's job type, such as steal for a thief or jump for the dragoon. Another unique feature that became a staple of the series that appears for the first time here is creature summons. Along with the summon skill, this story follows 4 young orphans, Lunith, Ark, Rafia, and Ingus. The group discovers a hidden cave and comes across a crystal which grants them some power. They receive a message from the crystal to restore balance to the world by defeating Xande. Xande is actually just a pawn of the cloud of darkness, an evil and malicious deity who wants to purge the world into chaos and destruction. The original Famicom version sold over 1.4 million copies in Japan. It would, however, not be re-released outside of Japan until 2006 as a remake for the Nintendo DS by Matrix Software. The Super Nintendo era, 1991 to 1994. Okay, here is where it gets a bit confusing, and I mean a lot. What was actually Final Fantasy IV for the Super Nintendo console was released as Final Fantasy II for its first release in North America. So, just to keep things straight, we are going to consider this as Final Fantasy IV. The game was first released in 1991 for the Super Nintendo. For Final Fantasy IV, the turn-based battle system became the active time battle system. The new ATB system, which enabled players to input attacks in real time during battles, would become a staple of many future Final Fantasy and Square games. Also, players could control up to 5 characters in their party now, instead of just 4. All the characters now had their own unique and unchangeable character class, set on a fictional version of Earth called the Blue Planet. This story featured a Dark Knight named Cecil Harvey who goes on a quest to stop the Dark Sorcerer Gubaev from destroying the world. The game was a critical and commercial success, selling about 1.44 million copies in Japan for the Super Famicom, and another 340,000 copies in North America for the Super Nintendo. This is also the first game that Final Fantasy franchise legend Tetsuya Nomura worked on as a debugger. Final Fantasy V is another installment from the 90s that only came out in Japan in 1992 for the Super Famicom. The active battle time system from Final Fantasy IV was back for this game, though it did have some minor tweaks. Final Fantasy V had also greatly expanded the job system, which enabled players to freely select various jobs or character classes to master, to gain unique skills and abilities. This story featured a young lad, an adventurer by the name of Bart Klauser, who comes in contact with a fallen meteor and is engulfed in an adventure to keep several magical crystals from releasing a being of pure evil named Exdeath. The game was critically well received and another huge hit for Square upon its release in Japan, selling over 2.45 million copies for the Super Famicom. Alrighty, Final Fantasy VI, which was released for the Super Nintendo in the US as Final Fantasy III. We keeping up? Landed in 1994 as the last Final Fantasy game for the console. For the 6th installment, Hironobu Sakaguchi assumed a producer role due to his increased duties as the executive vice president of Square. As a result, Yoshinori Kitase, who worked as the writer and planner for Final Fantasy V, co-directed the project alongside Hiroyuki Ito, who had been a staffer and designer for the series since the original. Kitase handled the game's overall story scenario, and Ito oversaw the battle system and gameplay aspects, along with Sakaguchi supervising Kitase's overall direction. Tetsuya Nomura graduated to become the graphic designer for the project, creating the iconic characters of Shadow and Setsia. The game's well known for the appearance of the big bad Kefka Palazzo, who became one of the most popular and iconic villains for the franchise. Kefka offered something different from the typical Final Fantasy villains. Kefka was infused with a great deal of maniacal mirth. Final Fantasy Fantasy VI marked the first in-game appearance of the duo Biggs and Wedge, in reference to the Rebel Alliance fighter pilots from Star Wars, and they would become an on-running gag throughout the franchise. Final Fantasy VI offered players a great deal of item customization of weapons, armor, and equipment. Even if characters do not start the game with magical abilities, they can learn magic techniques and summon monsters called espers using Magicite. The game was a smashing success, selling over 3.1 million copies worldwide for the Super Nintendo. The PlayStation era, 1997 to 2001. Until 1997, all the Final Fantasy games were always available for the Nintendo consoles. However, one day all that changed. The game was previously developed for Super Nintendo and then the Nintendo 64, but the cartridges for the N64 lacked the necessary storage space to meet the ambition of the project. In 1995, Square experimented with 3D graphics with the experimental tech demo called Final Fantasy SGI, which featured characters from Final Fantasy VI using polygon 3D character models. This put the company on the path to creating a Final Fantasy game using what at the time were modern 3D graphics for Final Fantasy VII. While there were rumors of Final Fantasy VII being developed for the N64, they did not come to pass, as the N64 cartridges could not meet the space demands for the data the game project would require, but the CD-ROM format could. Enter the Sony PlayStation console. Square confirmed in 1996 that Final Fantasy VII would be an exclusive release for the console, releasing in Japan in January of 1997 and North America later in September, and things were never the same. For the first time ever, Final Fantasy VII featured gameplay with fully rendered 3D characters instead of 2D animated sprites. For its time, the 3D rendered graphics were cutting edge, and Final Fantasy was the game of the future for the future of the medium. Like previous games, there was an overworld map with scaled down versions of the characters. However, these featured 3D character models over pre-rendered 2D backgrounds. Events or random encounters on the Square experimented with 3D graphics with the experimental tech demo called Final Fantasy SGI, which featured characters from Final Fantasy VI demands for the data the game project would require, but the CD-ROM format could. Enter the Sony PlayStation console. Square confirmed in 1996 that Final Fantasy VII would be an exclusive release for the console, releasing in Japan in January of 1997 and North America later in September, and things were never the same. For the first time ever, Final Fantasy VII featured gameplay with fully rendered 3D characters instead of 2D animated sprites. For its time, the 3D rendered graphics were cutting edge, and Final Fantasy was the game of the future for the future of the medium. Like previous games, there was an overworld map with scaled down versions of the characters. However, these featured 3D character models over pre-rendered 2D backgrounds. Events or random encounters on the overworld map would trigger player battles, which would be an upscaled 3D version of the area. In the overworld map, the character models were changed to look like super deformed, more simplified versions of the characters. The game also featured pre-rendered cinematic cutscenes. While they might look a little dated now, these cutscenes were pretty groundbreaking and revolutionary for their time. Thanks to the extra storage space offered by the CD format, Square was now able to include a great deal of full-motion video cutscenes. Our good friend Tetsuya Nomura was promoted to the main character design role for the game, taking over from longtime artist Yoshitaka Amano. Nomura was responsible for designing and creating some of the most popular, iconic, and enduring characters in the franchise, including Cloud Strife and Sephiroth. Final Fantasy VII's story offered a fun mix of sci-fi with fantasy, including the post-industrial city setting of Midgar. The story centers on a stoic mercenary named Cloud Strife, who joins an eco-terrorist group called Avalanche. Avalanche is rebelling against the company called Shinra for using Maker reactors, which the group believes are harmful to the planet and drains its lifeblood. The adventure unfolds in a plot where Cloud is forced to confront the demons of his past, and an evil, nihilistic villain named Sephiroth, a former soldier of Shinra who went mad and now seeks to get revenge by destroying everything. The initial PlayStation release for Final Fantasy required 3 game discs. The game was a worldwide critical and commercial smash hit. Final Fantasy VII remains the most popular and best-selling game in the series series to date. It received numerous spin-offs including the feature-length movie, Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, and the action RPG Dirge of Cerberus. And a long-awaited remake of the original that will feature new graphics and mechanics is currently in the works from Square Enix for the PlayStation 4. In terms of gameplay innovations, Final Fantasy VII was the first game in the series to use the term Limit Break. Technically, the actual Limit Break combat move made its debut in Final Fantasy VI, but it was not dubbed the Limit Break until Final Fantasy VII. The Sony PlayStation delivered another hit Final Fantasy installment in 1999 with Final Fantasy VIII. Final Fantasy VIII used a new battle system called the Junction System, which allowed players to use specialized weapons and equipment to improve their stats and techniques in battle. The summon magic was also tweaked with Final Fantasy VIII with the Guardian Forces system. Instead of just summoning a monster for one big attack, a Guardian Force creature could serve as an ally and a support character for the player party inside and outside of battles. The graphics also got an upgrade. Designers and artists Tetsuya Nomura and Yusuke Naora both strive to create characters with realistic proportions throughout the game. Final Fantasy VIII also saw the debut of the Gunblade for the franchise, an iconic weapon combining that of a gun and a sword in an elegant marriage of weaponry. That's since become a staple design element for the franchise. The story follows a young mercenary named Squall Leonhardt, who is out to stop an evil sorceress named Ultimecia from destroying the fabric of time by compressing it all into one moment in order to remake the universe as she sees fit. While matching the popularity of Final Fantasy VII was close to impossible, Final Fantasy VIII was still a smash hit and received a great deal of critical acclaim for its time. Final Fantasy IX marked the final PlayStation release for a Final Fantasy game in Japan and North America in the year 2000. The game was essentially designed as a modern throwback to the original Final Fantasy, featuring a look, characters, and art style that evoked that game. Development for the 9th game actually started before Final Fantasy VIII was completed. The game was directed by Hiroyuki and produced by Hironobu Sakaguchi and Shinji Hashimoto. While it was a bit of a departure from the more modern stylings of the last two games, Final Fantasy IX received praise for its nostalgic style. As of 2003, the game had sold over 5.3 million copies worldwide. The PlayStation 2 era, 2001 to 2006. The Final Fantasy series joined the PlayStation 2 console in 2001. Graphics received a major upgrade. Square was able to use fully integrated 3D areas over the usual pre-rendered 2D backdrops for the environments. This also marked the first Final Fantasy game that was fully voiced, with some results that were a little less satisfying for fans. Haha. The active battle system was also replaced by the conditional turn-based battle system. This system allows for party members and their enemies to have their turn ordered based on their specific stats. Characters could also participate in minigames such as Blitzball. The story features the young hero Tidus and is set in the fictional world of Spira. Together, Tidus joins with the summoner named Yuna in order to destroy a monster named Sin who destroyed Tidus' hometown. By 2004, the game sold over 6.6 million copies for the PlayStation 2. It remains one of the best-selling games for the console, and it was widely lauded by critics. Final Fantasy X marked another major landmark for the franchise. This was the first game in the series to receive a direct sequel, continuing the storyline and characters established in the previous game. This came in the form of Final Fantasy X2, released for the PlayStation 2 in 2003. X2 was a top-selling, well-reviewed title. Final Fantasy XI offered something decidedly different for the franchise by delving it into the realm of the massively multiplayer online role-playing games. The game launched in May 2002 for the PlayStation 2 and then made the jump to Windows PC later in November. It later became available for Xbox 360 in 2006. Final Fantasy XI was set in the fantasy world of Vana'diel, and players created their own digital avatars for quests and objectives. The gameplay style was decidedly different from previous installments in the series. The combat and battles occurred in real time instead of the turn-based randomly occurring battles in the past. The game featured a a 3D virtual world where players could freely roam around and encounter freely roaming enemies. Despite launching in 2002, the game is still running to this day for Windows PC. However, Square has since shut down the PlayStation 2 and Xbox 360 servers for the game last March. The game has received a number of updates and expansions over the last decade and a half. At its peak, Final Fantasy XI had up to 500,000 players. One of its bigger milestones in video gaming history is that Final Fantasy XI is listed in the Guinness Book of World Records as the first video game to allow cross-console gameplay between multiple platforms. That was between the Xbox 360, PlayStation 2, and Windows PC. This means that players on all of those different platforms could play together. Despite marking a major change for the franchise, Final Fantasy XI was well received by critics and was very popular. In 2012, Square Enix CEO Yoichi Wada said to an audience at Varna Fest that at the time, Final Fantasy XI was the most profitable game in the series yet. A mobile version of Final Fantasy XI is also in the works. Final Fantasy XII arrived in Japan for the PlayStation 2 in March 2006 and the US in October of the same year. While taking the game back to a strict RPG format, it featured many new changes for the Final Fantasy series. This is the first entry in the main Final Fantasy series that ditched the random enemy encounters and opted for real-time battles, which was dubbed the Active Dimension battle system. The game featured an open-world sandbox and a movable in-game camera system. Another major addition to the gameplay was the Gambit system, which allowed players to give the AI characters customizable commands. This way, AI characters would still act and perform moves in the way the player would want. Co-director Hiroyuki Ito built the Gambit system using similar programming algorithms for monsters who appeared in some of the Super Nintendo Final Fantasy installments. The game featured the fantasy realm of Ivalice, where the empires of Arcadia and Rosaria are engaged in a brutal civil war. A young princess named Ash forms a resistance movement with the young orphan Vaan, who wants to become a sky pirate. Together, they fight back against the Arcadian Empire's tyranny. The game received a Nintendo DS exclusive sequel, Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings, in 2007. A PlayStation 4 remaster entitled Final Fantasy XII The Zodiac Age, featuring high-definition graphics, is due to arrive later in 2017. As of 2009, the game sold over 6 million copies worldwide. It remains an excellently received, award-winning installment for the Final Fantasy franchise. Final Fantasy XIII first arrived for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 in Japan in December 2009, before hitting the rest of the world in March 2010. The game was built using Square Enix's, at the time, new proprietary game engine, Crystal Tools, allowing Final Fantasy XIII to be built for a number of platforms. The gameplay style was similar to that of 12, with players being able to control a third-person character on screen throughout the game, a movable camera system, and the new paradigm system. Under the paradigm system, players could assign each party member an offensive, defensive, or healing role. Under these roles, characters could then assume different formations during the battle under specific conditions. The game is set on a floating world called Cocoon, and the story follows a former soldier named Lightning. Lightning is seeking to fight against Cocoon's tyrannical government, Sanctum, who is purging civilians for coming into contact with the world below Cocoon, which is Pulse. Lightning seeks to rescue her sister Sarah, who has become an unwitting pawn of a godlike being from Pulse, the Pulse Vestige, aka Anima. As of 2014, Final Fantasy XIII has sold up to 11 million copies worldwide. That number has since climbed since the game was ported to Windows PC over 2 years ago. Final Fantasy XIII ultimately spawned its own offshoot sub-series for the franchise that is dubbed the Fabula Nova Crystallis Final Fantasy. The game received a number of sequels, including Final Fantasy XIII-2 and Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII. Final Fantasy XIV and Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn. Final Fantasy XIV was another foray into the world of the MMORPG, released exclusively for Windows PC in September 2010. Once again, players were able to create their own customized player avatar to explore a fantasy world, which was Auzia. For Final Fantasy XIV, Eorzea is under the threat of a hostile invasion from the Galan Empire and beastmen deities called the Primals. The game was actually meant to release for the PlayStation 3 and later the Xbox 360, but those plans fell through. The original version remained active until November 2012, when all its servers were shut down. The gameplay and user interface were widely criticized. The backlash for Final Fantasy XIV prompted Square Enix